They were building cities when the pyramids were just desert sand. Not hundreds of years before, not even 1,000. Try 7,000 years before the first stone was cut for Giza. And we're only finding out about this now. The place is called Nabta Playa, buried in the Nubian desert, about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel. What they built there changes everything we thought we knew about how civilization started. Because this wasn't some scattered tribe leaving behind primitive tools. These people were arranging massive stones to track stars with precision that shouldn't exist yet. They were herding cattle, making pottery, constructing ceremonial centers that drew people from across the region. And here's what keeps me up at night. If this level of sophistication existed in 7500 BC, what else are we missing? What other cities are still buried under sand, waiting to rewrite? History again? Possible yet. The Sahara wasn't always the dead wasteland we see today. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, this region went through what scientists call the African Humid Period. Seasonal monsoons brought rain. Lakes formed in areas that are now pure sand. And people, they followed the water. Nabta Playa became one of these seasonal gathering points, a temporary lake that filled during summer months, around 9300 BC, maybe earlier. These weren't simple nomads just passing through. Archaeological evidence shows they returned to the same location year after year, establishing what might be the world's first seasonal settlement pattern. They brought cattle with them, which is significant because we're talking about some of the earliest evidence of cattle herding in Africa. They weren't hunting these animals, they were managing them, which requires planning, cooperation, social organization. Then, around 6800 BC, something shifts. The settlements get bigger, more permanent. They start digging deep wells, sophisticated water management that lets them stay longer as the climate becomes less predictable. They're making pottery now, not importing it from somewhere else, but producing it locally. The ceramics they created are among the oldest identified in Africa, built with stone that makes Nabta Playa genuinely disturbing to conventional timelines. We're talking about megalithic structures, hundreds of them spread across roughly 2,500 meters of desert. Stone circles, massive upright slabs called stelae arranged in rows. Underground chambers lined with megalithic stones. And here's the thing that archaeology keeps tripping over. These monuments predate Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years, maybe more. When people in Britain were still figuring out basic agriculture, the inhabitants of Nabta Playa were already aligning stones to celestial events with mathematical precision. One stone circle in particular has been analyzed extensively. The way the stones are positioned, they track the summer solstice. But it goes deeper than that. Some researchers propose the stone arrangements map out star patterns, specifically matching constellations as they would have appeared in the sky around 6000 BC. Patterns, passing that knowledge down, refining it. That means literacy of a kind, even without writing. That means a stable enough society that people have time for activities beyond immediate survival. That means hierarchy, specialized roles, probably some form of religious or spiritual framework that makes all this effort worthwhile. These aren't characteristics we associate with prehistoric nomads. These are characteristics we associate with civilization, archaeological thinking for decades. Except Nabta Playa doesn't fit that model at all. There's no evidence of agriculture at the site during its peak period. What there is evidence of are wild cereal processing and cattle herding, which are pastoral activities, not agricultural ones. So how do you explain a society complex enough to build astronomical monuments and organize regional ceremonies without the agricultural base that's supposed to be prerequisite? No agriculture, no permanent settlements, just hunter-gatherers somehow organizing labor forces and artistic vision to create something monumental. The existence of Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa forces us to flip the script. Maybe monumentality came first. Maybe organized religion and communal ritual were the driving forces that led to agriculture and cities, not the other way around. Maybe the need to gather for ceremonies, to mark time and Cosmic events is what pushed humans toward permanent settlement. The sheer volume of cattle remains found at the site. Cattle bones everywhere, but specifically in contexts suggesting large-scale ritual slaughter. In pastoral societies, cattle are wealth. You don't kill them casually. You kill them for important occasions, ceremonies, gatherings that matter. The presence of so many cattle bones indicates these gatherings were significant events, possibly involving hundreds of people at a time. Structure this implies is pretty complex. Someone had to organize these gatherings. Someone decided where the stones would be placed. Someone held the astronomical knowledge necessary to align the monuments. That's not egalitarian tribal society. That's hierarchy. That's authority, possibly religious, possibly political, probably both fused together in ways that wouldn't have distinguished between them. And here's something that'll make you rethink Egyptian history entirely. Some researchers propose that the social structures developed at Nabta Playa became the foundation for the later Nile civilizations. The idea is that as the Sahara dried out progressively after 5000 BC, the people who had developed these complex social and religious systems migrated east toward the Nile Valley, bringing their organizational knowledge with them. Within 1,000 years of Nabta Playa's abandonment, you see the first Nile settlements developing into what would become dynastic Egypt. Dynasty begins. They have roots, predecessors, and Nabta Playa is one of the most likely candidates for where those roots grew. What's fascinating is how little attention Nabta Playa gets compared to Egyptian dynastic sites. Mention the pyramids, and everyone knows what you're talking about. Mention Nabta Playa, and you get blank stares, even from people interested in ancient history. Part of that is timing. The site wasn't extensively studied until the 1970s and 80s, so it's relatively recent in archaeological terms. Part of it is location. It's remote, difficult to access, not exactly tourist-friendly. Thought, long-term planning, and scientific observation thousands of years before we gave them credit for. That's humbling in a way that makes some people uncomfortable. Because if they could do this 9,000 years ago, what were they doing 12,000 years ago? 15,000? How much history is still buried that would force us to completely reimagine the human story? Work in Egypt has uncovered numerous pre-dynastic sites that show increasing levels of sophistication. In the Nile Delta, archaeologists recently found rare tombs dating to the pre-dynastic period, before the pharaohs, containing artifacts that demonstrate trade networks and craftsmanship far more advanced than expected for that era. At Giza itself, beneath the plateau where the pyramids would eventually rise, there's evidence of settlement and activity predating the 4th dynasty by centuries. Burial sites, pottery, seal impressions from before Khufu's reign, all indicating that Giza was already a significant location before anyone decided to build pyramids there. The site had meaning, history, possibly sacred status long before the first stone was cut, like bedrock quality and proximity to the Nile. But what if it was also about continuity, building on sites that already held cultural or religious significance for reasons we no longer fully understand? What if the pyramid builders chose Giza specifically because their ancestors had been gathering there for purposes now lost to time? These aren't just academic questions. They fundamentally alter how we understand cultural memory and the transmission of knowledge across millennia. Because if the pyramid builders were consciously connecting their monuments to much older traditions, that demonstrates historical awareness, a sense of legacy, a deliberate placement of themselves within a longer story. Nabta Playa. The stone circles fall silent. The seasonal gatherings end. Why? The most likely answer is environmental. The African Humid Period was ending. The monsoons that had brought seasonal rain for thousands of years were becoming less reliable. Lakes that used to fill every summer started drying up more frequently, staying dry longer. For a society dependent on seasonal water sources for their cattle, this would have been catastrophic. You, can adapt to gradual change, but at a certain point, the water simply isn't there anymore, and you have to move or die. Settlements along the Nile begin showing characteristics that echo Nabta Playa. By 3100 BC, Upper and Lower Egypt unify under the first pharaoh, and dynastic Egypt begins. But that's not the beginning of the story. That's a later chapter in a much longer book, one whose earlier pages were written in the sand at Nabta Playa, at Göbekli Tepe, at sites we probably haven't found yet. Still missing? Nabta Playa was only seriously studied starting in the 1970s. Before that, it was just another anonymous patch of desert that nobody thought to excavate. Göbekli Tepe wasn't discovered until 1994. These are massive, significant sites that completely change our understanding of prehistory, and we only found them in the last few decades. How many more are out there? How many have been destroyed by modern development before anyone realized they were important? How much of human history exists in a kind of dark age before writing, where sophisticated cultures rose and fell without leaving the textual records we rely on to know they existed, reconstructing entire civilizations from their garbage dumps and their most durable constructions, which is like trying to understand modern society by examining only concrete buildings and ceramic toilets. You'd miss most of what actually matters. The same is true for prehistory. What we call the beginning of civilization, the invention of writing around 3200 BC in Mesopotamia, that's not when civilization began. That's when civilization started. Writing things down. It's the beginning of history, not the beginning of complex human society. Isn't whether prehistoric people were sophisticated. The evidence overwhelmingly shows they were. The question is, how much sophistication we're still underestimating because the evidence hasn't survived or hasn't been found yet. Functioned as a kind of calendar, marking the summer solstice when the sun rose directly in line with specific stones. But some researchers, including astrophysicist Thomas Brophy, have proposed something far more ambitious. According to their analysis, the stone placements correspond to specific stars and constellations as they appeared in the sky around 6000 BC, accounting for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes star positions to shift over millennia. If this interpretation is correct and not all archaeologists accept it, then the builders of Nabta Playa understood precession, which requires observational astronomy maintained over centuries, refining the data over generations. At some point, someone notices that the positions are shifting, slowly but measurably. That person has to be trusted enough that others believe them, because precession isn't obvious over a single lifetime. You need institutional knowledge, record-keeping of some kind, even if it's oral, even if it's encoded in stone rather than written on papyrus. That level of cultural continuity is what we associate with organized civilizations, not with nomadic herders. Yet here it is 9,000 years ago in the middle of what's now desert. Considerable effort. You have to dig into bedrock, line the chamber with stones, perform the ritual sacrifice, seal it up. Why go to that trouble? What belief system requires burying cattle in stone-lined chambers beneath astronomical markers? We don't know, and we probably never will know with certainty, because the people who did this left no written explanation. But the fact that they did it, the sheer investment of labor and resources, tells us the beliefs involved were powerful enough to motivate extraordinary efforts, celebration, possibly sacrifice. This is a mindset we've largely lost in modern secular society, but it would have been fundamental to how Nabta Playa's builders understood their place in the universe. They weren't separate from the cosmos, they were participants in it, and the monuments they built were expressions of that participation. Prehistory. Stonehenge gets infinitely more attention. It's famous, protected, studied extensively, featured in countless documentaries. Nabta Playa is obscure by comparison, known mainly to specialists. Why the difference? Partly it's about accessibility and preservation. Stonehenge is in England, easy to reach, visually dramatic, well-maintained. Nabta Playa is in one of the most remote deserts on Earth, difficult to access, and the stones, themselves are less immediately impressive, scattered across a wide area rather than arranged in the iconic circle that makes Stonehenge so photographable. But I think there's also a cultural bias at play. We're more comfortable acknowledging sophisticated prehistoric engineering in Europe than in Africa, even though the African examples are often older and just as complex. Centuries. The idea that civilization spread from the Near East and Mediterranean to other regions, that Africa and the Americas were passive recipients of culture rather than innovators themselves, this narrative is deeply embedded in how archaeology developed as a discipline. Nabta Playa challenges that narrative directly. Here's an African site demonstrating astronomical knowledge and monumental construction contemporary with, or even predating, similar developments in the Near East. The builders of Nabta Playa weren't copying anyone because there wasn't anyone to copy yet. They were innovating independently, solving problems, developing knowledge systems from observation and experience, capacity for abstract thought and planning. The only difference is time and accumulated knowledge. If you could somehow transport a child from 7500 BC to the present and raise them in modern society, they'd be indistinguishable from any other child. They'd learn to read, use computers, understand calculus, whatever. The reverse is also true. A modern child raised at Nabta Playa would learn to navigate by stars, track seasonal patterns, participate in the same astronomical rituals. Intelligence isn't the variable here, knowledge is. And knowledge accumulates slowly, built generation by generation, occasionally leaping forward during moments of innovation, sometimes lost entirely when cultures collapse. The problem of tracking time without writing. They developed social structures capable of organizing labor for non-survival purposes. They created meaning systems that made sense of the cosmos and their place in it. And then, when the environment changed and they had to move on, some of that knowledge transferred to new contexts, while some of it was probably lost forever. We can see the stones, but we can't hear the songs they sang or the stories they told around fires, or the names they had for the stars they watched so carefully. Effort. They cared about cattle, about cosmic events, about gathering as a community. They valued continuity enough to return to the same site generation after generation. They believed something about the arrangement of stones and the movement of stars that was important enough to invest thousands of hours of labor with Stone Age tools. But the specifics, the texture of their daily experience, that's gone. Maybe fragments of Nabta Playa's culture survived in the traditions that developed along the Nile. The Egyptian obsession with astronomical precision, encoding the calendar into temple alignments and pyramid orientations, could that trace back to knowledge developed at Nabta Playa? The emphasis on cattle in early dynastic symbolism, the importance of stone monuments as expressions of cosmic order, the concept of sacred geography where certain locations held special significance. These elements have to come from somewhere. Cultural traits don't appear from nothing. They evolve from earlier forms, and Nabta Playa is one of the most likely candidates for where some Egyptian cultural DNA originated. Eventually founded dynastic Egypt weren't just former Nabta Playa inhabitants. They were a mix of populations from various regions, each bringing their own traditions. But among those populations, among those traditions, the Nabta Playa lineage was likely present, contributing its astronomical knowledge and its architectural impulses to the cultural synthesis that became ancient Egypt. And if that's true, then the pyramids weren't actually the beginning of Egyptian monumental tradition. They were a continuation, a refinement of impulses that started thousands of years earlier, when someone in the Sahara looked at the stars and decided to mark their movements with stones, came together to acknowledge something larger than themselves. It was a nexus of knowledge where astronomical observations accumulated and were encoded in stone. It was the foundation, the cultural bedrock upon which later civilizations built their pyramids and temples and kingdoms, and it was forgotten, buried under sand for thousands of years, lost to history until archaeologists started asking the right questions in the right places. The ultimate lesson of Nabta Playa: how much we don't know. How much has been forgotten. How many other sites like this are still buried, still waiting for someone to recognize their significance. The story of human civilization is longer and more complex than we've given it credit for. We're not the first generation to be sophisticated, to ask big questions, to try to understand our place in the cosmos. People were doing that 9,000 years ago at Nabta Playa, 11,000 years ago at Göbekli Tepe, probably even earlier at sites we haven't found yet. We're part of a continuum, standing on foundations laid by people whose names we'll never know, but whose legacy shaped the world we inherited. Architectural and astronomical knowledge for thousands of years before the first pharaoh took the throne. Nabta Playa is part of that developmental arc, a crucial early chapter in a story that we're only now beginning to read properly. And every time archaeologists uncover another pre-dynastic site, another piece of evidence of sophisticated prehistoric culture, the timeline gets pushed back further, the story gets more complex, and the achievements of our ancestors become more impressive. To their communities, people who were, in every meaningful sense, just as human as we are, just as curious, just as capable, just as driven to understand and mark their existence. They built cities of stone in the desert, aligned them to the heavens, and then vanished when the climate changed, leaving behind monuments that would eventually inspire the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. Probably as fascinated by this as I am. What aspect of Nabta Playa strikes you most? The astronomical precision? The timeline that predates everything we thought we knew? The idea that Egyptian civilization has roots reaching back thousands of years before the pharaohs? Drop a comment with your thoughts, because I genuinely want to know what resonates with people about this. And if you're into this kind of deep dive into history that challenges the standard narrative, hit that subscribe button, because there's so much more to explore. Ancient cultures that don't fit the models we've been taught, archaeological finds that force us to rethink everything, mysteries that might never be fully solved, but are absolutely worth investigating. That's what this channel is about. And if that sounds like your kind of thing, I'd love to have you along for the ride.